Okay, welcome everyone. Welcome to the second Young Scholars webinar of the fall 2025 season. I'm Connor Walsh, I'll be the moderator today, and today we're very happy to have Constanza Abuin, who will present her paper, Power Decarbonization in a Global Energy Market, the Climate Effects of US LNG Exports. Constanza is a postdoctoral fellow at Princeton University in the International Economics section, and she'll join Johns Hopkins University as an assistant professor of economics in fall 2026. Her research lies at the intersection of international trade, energy, and environmental economics. She holds a PhD in economics from Harvard University. As always, we'll have some time for questions after the presentation. To ask any questions, please use the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen. And Constanza, you will have 45 minutes, so please take it away.
Okay, perfect. Thanks everyone for being here. Thanks Connor for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here. And let me just get started by discussing a trend in energy markets that motivates this project. We know that in the US, the shale revolution happened in the early to mid 2000s, and essentially what that made was that generated a change in the global trade balance in terms of natural gas. The US became the #1 gas exporter worldwide. First, because of the shale gas revolution, but also something else needed to happen in this environment for the US to start exporting out all of this LNG or all of this natural gas. What happens is that essentially in 2016, the US started building infrastructure to export liquefied natural gas, and that was a key point that made the US change its trade position. So LNG is just natural gas that has been cooled down to liquid form for ease and safety of transportation. It has made natural gas trade increasingly global. Now 30% of production internationally is traded. And it has a particular feature. LNG requires specialized infrastructure that most of the times is subject to government approval. In order to trade natural gas as LNG, you need liquefaction plants that turn the gas into liquid, specialized vessels, and you need regasification plants that turn the liquid back into gas. So I'm going to argue throughout this talk that because this infrastructure is subject to government approval, many governments throughout the world have essentially often unused tool to influence natural gas prices across the world, and through natural gas prices, potentially the path of global carbon emissions. So back to the US, if we look at how LNG export capacity in the US is set to evolve in the future, we see that there's already a number of projects that are under construction that are going to essentially increase export capacity for the US by over 50%. What's more, there's a set of projects that have been proposed that have not yet reached final investment decision, but if they get built, these massive projects will actually double the US export capacity. So there's a lot of proposed capacity in the pipeline, and the key question in the last few years was what's going to happen when this capacity gets built. Back in January last year, when Biden was still in power in the US, the Department of Energy decided to pause the approval of new liquefied natural gas export terminals under the argument that they wanted to revise their methodology to assess the environmental impact of these terminals. They claimed that the environmental impact of these terminals was not easy to measure under their current methodology, so it was better to just pause the approval until further notice. This, of course, generated a lot of market upheaval. It was a decision that was challenged in the courts. And one of the first measures of the Trump administration was actually to reverse this pause in export approvals and going back to releasing export permits. But the question still remains, and what I'm going to try to target in this project is specifically the question, what happens when the US exports LNG to global decarbonization? My project is going to take into account life cycle emissions, but I'm going to particularly focus throughout this talk and in most of the paper on what happens to the electricity sector. This is because electricity is 40% of current global CO2 emissions, and also because a large share of these emissions from electricity come from countries that use LNG as an important part of their energy mix. So there's essentially two camps in this discussion about what LNG could do to global electricity emissions. Proponents of LNG exports say that by exporting LNG, a country like the US is going to help phase out dirtier coal generation from importing countries. While those that oppose LNG claim that exporting LNG is going to make gas cheaper abroad and is going to essentially delay the transition to renewables in many importing countries. So this is essentially a question about substitution effects across time, and that's exactly what my main theoretical framework and the estimation that I'm going to tell you briefly about is going to try to incorporate. I'm going to, in this project, build a quantitative framework that's going to have two main components. First, I'm going to incorporate the endogenous entry and exit of power generators that potentially can use different energy sources. And the idea of why it's important to incorporate these endogenous dynamics into the problem is that we care about this question of whether natural gas replaces cleaner or dirtier electricity generation, but because electricity infrastructure is long-lived, we need to consider how these plants get built and decide to exit the market if we want to understand how other countries are going to potentially react to this input shock. The second thing that my model is going to incorporate is international trade in fossil fuel inputs under capacity constraints. And this is essentially because if we want to analyze the potential effects of an export shock, we need to consider price effects and endogenous price changes both in the US and abroad. I'm going to tell you briefly how I use essentially a lot of the public data that we have available for the natural gas, coal, and electricity sectors worldwide to estimate the main parameters in my model. And one of the things that I'm going to highlight is that I can use information on the universe of power generators across the world to try to back out the parameters governing investment decisions in my model. But first, let me tell you essentially a bit of what I find. In my main counterfactual, I compare a world in which the US builds every project of LNG export capacity that has been announced to a world in which it just builds what has already been approved and is under construction. Okay, so I'm essentially going to compare two different slopes of changes in liquefied natural gas export capacity. I'm going to find that in a world in which all projects get built, global power CO2 emissions actually get reduced slightly because of LNG exports. This is a small reduction, but it still holds once we incorporate life cycle emissions from exports. So it's not just entirely in the power sector, but this global emission reduction holds with upstream emissions as well. I'm going to tell you about the main mechanisms that explain this result. Essentially, what's going to happen is that under the lens of my quantitative model, in the US, higher gas prices will decrease gas-fired generation and accelerate the renewable adoption in the US, while in the rest of the world, I'm going to have an effect that changes signs over time. In the short term, I'm going to observe this faster coal phase-out, but this will be more than offset by a long-term effect of delay in renewable adoption outside of the US. However, because the US is such a major gas consumer, what happens in the US ends up trumping everything that happens in the rest of the world. So it's going to be a major driver of this slightly emission reduction that we get with more gas exports. I'm going to tell you about the specific mechanisms that explain this, particularly in importing countries, this change of sign over time. And I'm going to tell you about how there's a lot of heterogeneity across space with how a country reacts to lower natural gas prices. And it's going to depend a lot on the current fleet of their power generations. The current infrastructure that a country has is going to matter a lot to predict whether they're going to increase their emissions or lower their emissions when natural gas prices become cheaper. And I'm going to also discuss how the pace of technological adoption actually influences results in my model. Because I get this finding that essentially the US, by exporting more LNG, seems to be cleaning up at the expense of the rest of the world, I'm going to consider potential policies that might make this outcome better. How could the US export LNG and still limit the emission increase outside of the country. One of the things that I considered is international coordination. And I find that if the US coordinates with just 3 major gas consumers, the EU, UK, and Japan, climate savings would be 60% larger than they are under a setting with no coordination. The other policy that I consider is a policy in which the US, once it figures out that in the long term emissions begin to increase outside of the country, it just reverts the LNG expansion to regular levels. It just closes off all extra capacity. And I find that actually reverting the policies is worse for importing countries than not doing it in the first place. And I'm going to show you that this has a lot to do with the persistence of power sector infrastructure and how this affects substitution across time. Let me just skip the related literature just to make sure that I have enough time for questions, and just quickly go over the main features of the setting that I'm going to be incorporating in my analysis. Of course, we know that across the world, there's a large heterogeneity in how electricity is produced and how many carbon emissions per unit of electricity are produced in this process. And a key driver of this difference in the carbon emission intensity across countries is essentially the types of power generators that are installed in each country. We know that a coal generator generates 40% more emissions than a gas generator. And of course, these are both they both generate emissions that solar and wind don't. So the types of power generators that get installed in each country are going to matter a lot for the carbon intensity. So what my model is going to try to do is to highlight 3 potential drivers of these decisions to install given power generators in different markets. One of the things that that's going to feature prominently in my model is, of course, fossil fuel prices that change across time and across space. And this is essentially because 70% of the operating costs of a fossil fuel plant actually are fossil fuel prices. The cost of buying natural gas is 70% of the cost of operating a natural gas generator. So of course, if you look at the difference in adoption of gas and coal generators across space, you're going to find that places with lower coal and gas prices are the ones that are most likely to adopt these types of generators. The other thing that's going to feature prominently in my model is that there's a lot of heterogeneity across space and across time on how profitable it is to adopt renewables. This is, of course, because of natural conditions. Some places are just sunnier than others, and this generates more profitable adoption of solar. It has to do as well with technological progress, because we know that solar costs and wind costs and the cost of storage, for instance, have been declining over time, and that's going to influence the path of adoption in my model. But the third thing that I'm going to take into account is that there's also a lot of heterogeneity in the policies that different countries take to incentivize, if anything, the adoption of renewables. And I'm going to take into account that there's policy differences across space that I don't observe, and try to back out these differences across space in my estimation. Lastly, let me just show you a picture of the age distribution of fossil fuel generators in different markets, because this is going to, as I mentioned before, this is going to matter for my results. Essentially, if you look at a country like India, most of coal generators in India are very, very young. They have been installed in the last 30 years. If you go to a country like the US, the situation is quite different. Coal generators are very old, and they are close to the point in which they are deciding to exit the market, or it's becoming more obvious that they have to exit the market. These differences in age across space are going to matter for how countries react to input shocks in my model. Okay. And lastly, I talked about LNG export capacity and the expansion of LNG export capacity as a potential force that affects input prices across the world. In order for you to believe me, you need to think that actually there's some export capacity constraint, because otherwise the policies would not change anything. just want to point out that today most countries operate LNG export terminals that are over 80% in terms of capacity utilization. So what that means essentially is that whether new projects get built or not are going to relax a lot the constraint that today we see in exporting LNG. So let me just tell you about a little bit about the data and my sample and what I'm going to do with when I take them all to the data. I'm going to focus in the largest countries in terms of electricity generation and emissions as the country units in my sample. I'm essentially going to deal with markets as if they were countries, except for a few key points. I'm going to break the US into 3 regions. I'm going to take the EU as just one region, but essentially think about markets as countries. And I'm going to go back and collect for each one of these markets the information that I need to be able to predict these entry and exit decisions for generators across these markets. This is going to mean having information on wholesale electricity prices, fossil fuel prices, the renewable generation potential per market. I'm going to have some data on the evolution of installation costs by technology and by market. And something that's going to be critical is that I'm going to have information on the universe of power generators in the last 20 years. I'm going to see all coal and gas generators that have been operating in each one of these markets, and I'm going to see when they entered the market and if they exited the market, when they did so, and their characteristics. And this data is going to be critical to estimate the main parameters that govern dynamics in my model. So let me just now jump into the model. I'm going to do this in 2 steps. I'm going to first tell you a little bit about how electricity operations and investment decisions are made within a market, taking fossil fuel prices as exogenous or as given. And then I'm going to show you how I endogenize these fossil fuel prices in a global equilibrium. So first, consider one single market. And in this market, my agents in the model are going to be electricity generators that are going to have a few characteristics. First, I'm going to assume that these guys are small and they take the price of their output, electricity, and inputs, fossil fuels, for instance, as given. I'm also going to assume that they have a given type that they cannot change. They are either gas, coal, solar, wind, or storage. Okay, think about these types. And they're going to have a given production capacity and an age that I'm going to keep track of that's going to affect their maintenance costs. So older generators are potentially going to have to pay a higher maintenance cost to stay in the market. So what's going to happen in one period in my model is the following. These generators are going to wake up. They are going to observe the state of the world. They are going to know who they are competing against and what the prices they face are, fossil fuel prices, the prices of their inputs. Then they are going to make their entry and exit decisions, where essentially I'm going to assume that there's incumbents in the market that draw these maintenance costs from a they draw random maintenance costs from a distribution and decide whether they want to stay in next period or not. And if they want to stay next period, they have to pay this maintenance cost. And then I'm going to have potential entrants to these markets that draw entry costs, installation costs, and decide whether they enter to the market next period or not. Once these decisions are made, everyone is going to compete in my wholesale electricity market, and electricity prices are going to get set as usual. Okay, and then we're moving on to the next year. So I'm going to start by telling you a little bit about how these generators make their production decisions, and then I'm going to turn into investment decisions. First, when I think about how these generators make production decisions, the first assumption I'm going to make is that they face an inelastic electricity demand. This is not something that's very important, or this is an assumption that can be relaxed, but for simplicity, I'm just going to assume that there's a given demand that needs to be satisfied. And the question is like, okay, who is supplying the electricity? There's going to be a different set of assumptions for fossil fuel generators and renewables in my model. Fossil fuel generators, I'm going to assume that they are homogeneous within a market and within a year. So think about every coal generator in Texas is going to be the same. they're going to have the same cost function. And their cost function is essentially going to depend on two things. It's going to depend on the fossil fuel price that they have to pay, the price of coal, okay, this PFT, the price of coal in time t. And then it's going to depend on how much of their capacity they are using, with the idea that if they are using more of their capacity, potentially their marginal costs are going to be higher. This cost function is going to give me essentially something very convenient, which is that within a market, every coal generator and every gas generator is going to choose the same optimal capacity use per period. And how are they going to they're going to choose this optimal capacity use? They're just going to choose it by setting price equals marginal cost, okay? This is going to be relevant for how I back out the parameters in this cost function later in the game. Moving to renewable generators, I'm going to just assume that solar and wind generators have zero marginal costs, but that there's going to be heterogeneity in how much time of the year they actually can operate, okay? Think about essentially a local capacity factor that changes over market. So if we are talking about California, solar generators in California are just going to be able to operate at a higher capacity use than solar generators in Boston, just by the nature of conditions, of natural conditions in these markets. When I bring this model to the data, I'm going to essentially add a few more bells and whistles here. Something that I want to highlight is that I'm going to incorporate storage into my model. So there's going to be batteries that are going to operate just as a generator, but with a different feature. Essentially, the batteries are going to be, if they are active in a market, they're going to buy electricity from in the day and sell it during the night. So instead of having just one period in my model, this period is going to be broken down in two. There's a day and a night. And if there's batteries in the market, batteries are going to buy electricity from solar generators during the day in order to sell it during the night. This means that instead of having to clear one electricity market per period, I'm just going to clear two electricity markets that are going to be jointly cleared in equilibrium, okay? And I also end up adding carbon trading schemes, which essentially means that there's going to be on the side of the electricity price, there's going to be a carbon price that is essentially determined in equilibrium. Hold on a sec. Okay. So that's essentially it in terms of how production is decided. Now let's move on to how investment is decided in my model. I'm going to essentially I'm sorry. I'm going to essentially have, as I said before, incumbents in this market and potential entrants. So what's an incumbent? It's a generator that is already in the market, and every period is going to observe a maintenance cost and decide whether it wants to pay this maintenance cost and stay in the market or leave. This maintenance cost is going to come out from a distribution, okay, which I'm going to assume is logit and potentially will depend on the age. So I'm going to assume that the mean of this distribution or the scale of distribution is potentially related to the age. And that's going to allow me for older generators to potentially face higher maintenance costs. Once they observe this maintenance cost, they're going to make their decision. And what's critical in this setting is that I'm going to be able to write this decision as a probability. The probability of exiting the market if I'm a coal generator in the US before I observe the particular draw of the maintenance cost that I end up having to pay. For solar and wind generators, the structure is going to be a little bit different in the sense that I don't observe solar exit in this market. So I'm just going to assume that they have a fixed operational lifetime. And they are going to have to calculate the value function, but to enter this market, not to decide how to exit. So that's essentially what happens with exit. If we move to what happens with entry, I'm sorry. I'm essentially going to have n potential entrants of each type each period that pay an entry cost that is subject to a logit shock. It's very similar to what happens with potential exitors, and entry strategy is also going to be a probability of entering the market. And with these two features, essentially I'm going to be able to solve the model under two assumptions. I'm going to assume that these guys have perfect foresight. And I'm going to assume that there's a terminal period at which the industry reaches a steady state. That's going to be critical for my equilibrium. So what's an equilibrium? An equilibrium in a given market is going to be a conditional on electricity prices and fossil fuel conditional on fossil fuel prices. What happens, the entry and exit decisions and the electricity prices such that everyone is making their optimal choice. Now I just want to tell you how I determine the natural gas and coal prices in my model. Essentially, I'm going to have fossil fuel producers across space. There's going to be in each country that produces fossil fuels a representative producer that decides how much fossil fuel that can be natural gas or coal, to sell domestically and how much to export. How these guys are going to make these choices essentially by looking at two prices and two costs. The price of selling domestically, this PFJT, think about the Henry Hub natural gas price in the US, and the price of exporting, which there's just going to be one international export price, one for gas and one for coal. So these guys are going to face a domestic price and an international price. And they're going to have an increasing marginal production cost and a cost of exporting that's going to depend on how much capacity there is in the market. So what happens when you relax the export capacity constraint, when you build more export capacity in a given market? Essentially what's going to happen is that now the cost of exporting becomes lower. Natural gas producers in the country find it more profitable to export. So because of this, they're going to produce more, and this is going to increase the marginal cost of production. It's going to increase the domestic price such that producers sell both abroad and domestically. So that's essentially the spillover that we're going to see in the US. If you expand the export capacity, there's going to be more exports, a higher production cost, and thus higher domestic prices that are going to affect the decisions of generators. And then what I'm going to essentially do to close the market is I'm going to add other layers of complexity. I'm essentially going to assume that natural gas and coal are also consumed by other industries, for heating uses, and so on and so forth. But what's going to matter is that there's going to be a path of natural gas prices and coal prices that solve my model for each one of these markets and the international market, such that everyone is making their dynamic consumption decisions and fossil fuel markets and electricity markets clear. I'm sorry.
Do you want to take a sec, Constanza? Are you okay?
Yeah, no, I'm okay. I think I'm going to take a few seconds. I'm sorry. I have this cough. I've had it for a couple of weeks, and I'm already super tired of it.
No problem at all.
Okay. Okay. I think I'm good now. And I want to have some time to discuss the counterfactuals and have some questions. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the estimation of the model, but I do want to flag some things that are critical for my results. The first thing that I want to flag is the cost function of power generators is essentially going to determine how profits for generators change when prices of natural gas and coal change throughout the world. The second thing that I want to flag that I'm going to have to back out through the data is the distribution of this entry and maintenance costs that generators have to pay, because essentially together with profits, that's going to determine how the electricity capacity evolves when there's a shock to change. Just quickly, for the cost function of these fossil fuel generators, I essentially told you that the way that I wrote down this cost function allows me to express the optimal choice of these generators as one optimal capacity use for generators of gas in a given market in a given year. And luckily, we have data on the capacity use of generators of a given type of a given year across markets. And with data on wholesale electricity prices, I'm just going to be able to essentially run a model-based IV regression to recover the efficiency of generators and how much profits change with how much capacity they use. I'm going to have to deal with endogeneity concerns here, so I'm essentially going to be instrumenting, for instance, for the capacity use of generators with the use of other renewable sources in these markets, but not to go into a lot of detail on the instrumental strategy. We can discuss that in the Q&A. Essentially, I'm going to find out beta ones, which are the parameters that govern efficiency in my model, how much inputs you need to create output, electricity, that are roughly in line with the engineering estimates. And the most important thing here is that I'm going to find that the profits of coal generators are on average 40% higher than the profits of natural gas generators. And this makes sense because we know that coal generators are much more expensive to build. So the only way that you would have both types of generators in a given market is that coal generators are getting a higher profit per unit than gas generators. The second, one other thing that I mentioned was this elasticity of supply of fossil fuels. Here I'm just going to use a log linear production function of log quantities on log prices, and I'm going to observe yearly production and prices for different countries around the world and back out this supply elasticity. What essentially I'm going to do to deal with this with potential endogeneity of supply to unobserved cost shocks is instrumenting the price of fossil fuels by an interaction between population growth and the initial share of the fossil fuel and electricity generation. So what's the idea here? If you're a country that in the year 2000 was using a lot of natural gas for electricity generation, and now population grows a lot in this country, and let's assume that this population growth has nothing to do with unobserved shocks to fuel extraction, then this country is going to have a higher residual demand for natural gas. There's going to be a lot of demand for natural gas because population has grown a lot, electricity needs have grown a lot, and I'm using a lot of gas for electricity. That's going to be essentially the shifter that affects prices exogenously in my model. Using that, I recover a supply elasticity that is much lower for gas than for coal. And this is going to matter because when the US starts exporting more and it has a low supply elasticity, this means that a lot of the change in natural gas prices is going to be happening locally for the US to actually export more. Third, let me just walk you through how I recover these maintenance costs of fossil fuel generators. Here I'm going to use the data on these exit events of generators across the world. Essentially what you should think about here is that I have written down exit as a probability of exit in a given market in a given year. And I observe exit of generators in market on the year. So essentially what I'm doing is running a model-based regression that matches observed exit probabilities with the probability that my model predicts. And what's going to be critical is how these probabilities change with age. And I'm going to find that the probability of exit increases a lot with age, and the decision to exit becomes much more elastic to what happens with profits as you get older. And this is going to be critical for my results. Lastly, in terms of estimation, and then we can just go back to talking about my results, I mentioned that one of the key features in this setting is that we don't observe subsidies, how different countries subsidize, for instance, solar generation across the world. So I'm going to actually try to recover these potential differences in subsidies across the world. The way I'm going to do it is essentially by matching the entry that my model predicts of solar and wind and coal generators and gas generators across the world with what I see in the data. And by matching my model predictions with what I see in the data, I'm essentially going to recover an implicit subsidy or implicit tax for the installation costs of different types of generators, such that my model can match reality. Just to give you a sense of what I find, in yellow, you observe the data that we have on how much installation costs are in different markets for solar generators. And in black, you see installation costs once I incorporate these implicit subsidies or taxes. So essentially what I back out is that Japan has around a 30% subsidies for solar generators. The US has a subsidy as well under the lens of my model. But a country like India, for instance, has an implicit tax for solar. Of course, this doesn't mean that this is an actual tax, but for some reason, let's say this could be, for instance, longer permitting times, solar entry in India is much more expensive than the only way that I can rationalize solar entry at this pace in India is by including a tax. Essentially, this is what this is telling me. Okay, so let me go back to discussing my results. I told you that essentially what I was going to do is compare two worlds. I'm essentially going to compare a world in which only the LNG export capacity in this black line gets built. So a world in which we follow this export capacity path, with a world in which we follow this dashed export capacity expansion, okay? So these are essentially the two scenarios that I'm going to compare. I find compared to the world, this dashed zero line is going to be the world in which only the LNG export capacity that is already under construction gets built. I'm going to find that fossil fuel prices, gas prices in the US are going to be roughly 6% larger if you build more export capacity than in the baseline, while coal prices are going to be lower in the US. Of course, internationally, coal prices are going to be higher in the US as well. Internationally, I find a roughly 2% decrease in gas prices because of this export shock. Something that's important to highlight here is that, of course, there's a difference, a magnitude difference between the gas price increase in the US and internationally. One of the things that explains this is this upstream very low elasticity of supply. So when you increase export capacity, much of the adjustment happens in the US. Another thing that explains this is that actually there's a lot of slack coming into future international LNG markets because Qatar and Canada are both going to be building a lot of export capacity that I feed into my model. And once I introduce this into my model, it turns out that the export capacity that the US is building is not going to change things as much as we think. Going back to the results in terms of what this does to emissions, I told you that I found essentially a decrease in emissions globally because of this shock. And this is just focusing in the power sector, but as I said, this holds in the life cycle analysis. This is mostly driven by what happens in the US, where there's a constant decrease in cumulative emissions. But if you look at the rest of the world, first there's this decrease in emissions, and then there's an increase. And much of the rest of my paper is essentially trying to explain why this is happening and where this is happening. I just want to highlight that if we look at two different moments in time, 2030 and 2070, we have countries, for instance, like Japan, that decrease their emissions. In 2030, they experience a decrease in emissions because of this shock, but then in 2070, they have higher emissions because of the shock. And then countries like Bangladesh that always have lower emissions because of this shock. So I'm going to try to figure out why this is the case. And one of the things that I highlight was the importance of the age of coal generators across markets. So this is every year here is a coal generator cohort. So the year of entry of a cohort of coal generators. And this is how much the capacity of coal generators of that cohort changes once natural gas prices become cheaper in importing countries. So this is how much exit essentially of coal generators of different cohorts I have across markets once I increase the US export capacity. And you can see here that the cohorts that actually react a lot to this shock are on the older side. So it's either very old generators or generators that have yet not entered the market and are deciding whether to exit or not, or to enter or not. But generators that have already entered the market and are very young are essentially not going to care that much about what happens with natural gas prices. They have already sunk the cost, and their maintenance cost or the cost that they have to pay to stay in the market is very low, so might as well stay until it becomes more prohibitively expensive. Okay. This is going to explain a lot of the heterogeneity across space. Another thing that's going to be relevant for my results is that when cheaper natural gas is crowding out renewables, it does so in a particular moment of time. When renewables are super, super cheap, and this is, for instance, what's happening with solar now, the entry of solar generators is not going to be very elastic to what happens with the price of natural gas. When the price of renewables or the entry cost of renewables is very high, there's not much that's going to change in terms of the entry decision, but with changes in the price of natural gas. But when the prices of renewables or the installation cost of renewables are going down, but they have not yet reached their minimum, that's when essentially entry in my model is super elastic to changes in natural gas prices. Think about this as essentially generators that are thinking about whether to enter the market. They know that the price of electricity in the future markets is going to be much cheaper because entry is becoming super cheap. And they need to figure out whether to enter or not. And they're going to care a lot about their profits in the first few years to enter the market. That's why they are very elastic to natural gas prices. And that's why essentially what an increase in exports of natural gas is doing in importing countries in my model is essentially delaying the entry of renewables when costs are kind of in between very high and or becoming lower but have not reached their minimum. Okay. I think I'm going to close now, and we can think about talking about other contractuals with the Q&A and the questions, but I just want to make sure I have enough time. Perhaps something that I do want to mention is this international coordination potential that I said before. I look at how the US could make the shock internationally better. And I look at essentially the US committing with the UK, EU, and Japan to add carbon caps in response to a shock. So let's say that the UK knows that the shock is going to increase emissions by X% in their country, and they can add or change their emission trading scheme such that they make sure that emissions don't increase. If they do that in just these 3 unilateral markets, there's an increase in carbon savings of 60%. So why does this happen? Of course, there's a mechanical effect, which is now we're making sure that Japan is not increasing its emissions because natural gas is cheaper. But there's also a non-mechanical effect, which is the fact that these countries are the ones that are much more, that increase their emissions the most because of this shock. So when these guys reduce their demand for gas goes to countries that actually use the gas to phase out coal generators. So essentially what this is doing is moving demand of gas from gas that use it to displace from countries that use it to displace renewables to countries that use it to displace coal. And this turns out to be important quantitatively in my results. And that's it. Just let me wrap up with a conclusion. I just show you a framework to study investment responses to electricity input shocks. There's a lot of dynamic trade-offs in designing these policies. You might get short-run emission reductions that come at the expense of long-run emission increases. And there's, of course, global coordination trade-offs. And part of the goal of this project is to think about how we can incorporate both of these trade-offs in a quantitative analysis. And that's it. Thank you.
Great. Well, that was wonderful. I'm going to start by turning the floor over to Thea, who has a question. Can you unmute yourself?
Yes,
Yeah.
hi. Thank you,
Hi.
Constanza, for this excellent presentation. Also enjoyed reading your paper. It's super rich already. So my question targets a bit the intersection between energy security and energy transition. And I see that your model assumes that future LNG demand evolves smoothly, also due to the inelasticity that you have in the model. But I was wondering, how does your model account for major external shocks to LNG demand, like Europe's shift away from Russian oil and gas after the onset of the war in 2022? And do you think that ignoring these demand shocks could lead to an underestimation of the future impacts of this US or in general LNG exports on global prices and emissions?
Yeah, that's I don't know, Connor, if you want to collect questions, or I can go one by one. It's the same for me.
How about you respond to Thea first, and then we'll move on.
Okay, sounds good. That's definitely important here, and essentially I've tried different projections for gas supply from other countries and for gas demand outside of electricity, because gas demand inside of electricity is endogenous, but there could be, I don't know, the growth of AI might affect gas demand. So I use different projections for that. Of course, the higher is relative demand for natural gas. What's going to happen is that, I think you might have in mind, the effect in the rest of the world is going to become much more powerful relative to what I find in the US. So if Russia stops selling any gas, and I mean, in my model, I think I assume that the pipeline gas just stays constant on 2023 levels. But if Russian gas is no longer in the market, that's going to mean that the US, the negative effect on the rest of the world becomes more important. And that's why I highlight this coordination potential, is to try to solve this potential offset. I think there's another sort of interesting question that has to do with uncertainty in this market and what the gains that we get as LNG consumers, or the gains that potential LNG consumers get from knowing that they might be able to import LNG from the US if a shock happens. So that has a lot to do with, I mean, we can't think about this gain in a world with perfect foresight, but I think really understanding the importance of uncertainty in this setting is super relevant, and that's something that I'm really looking forward to working on.
Oh, thank you so much.
Great. And now we have Caroline, who has a couple of comments and questions.
Hi, so thank you very much for a very interesting presentation and a very good paper. I think it's very policy relevant, and I really like the focus on international spillovers. And also that we can see kind of the US LNG story in relation to the EU carbon market, because you kind of then illustrate that the spillover effects kind of depend on the policy environment as well. And maybe the question or the comment that I have is based on Bard Harstad's work on supply-side climate policies. Mm-hmm. So he finds that restricting fossil fuel supply sometimes is like more effective than carbon pricing on the demand side. So should kind of the LNG export policy be analyzed as a supply-side climate instrument in the same spirit? Or like, is it essentially a supply side climate policy in reverse, kind of, or yeah?
Yeah, no, I think that's super interesting, and I agree. I think exporting from the perspective of the US, this is essentially second best carbon tax, or that's the way I see this. You can this expanding export opportunities essentially acts as a carbon tax in the US because it increases the price of gas in the US. So it's essentially a supply side policy to try to get at the environmental goal. That's the way I see it. I think also there's a lot of interesting questions of whether you might have commitment problems and then supply side responses become more important. But there's a lot to answer to analyze in Bar's work.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, is there anyone in the audience who'd like to ask a question? If so, raise your hand or post it in the chat. I'll give you a couple of seconds. Okay, doesn't look like it. Well, in that case, we might leave it there then. So thanks so much, Constanza. That was super interesting. Our next Young Scholar webinar is going to take place on November 3rd. The speaker will be Alan Xiao from Stanford University, and he's going to present his paper, The Global Effects of Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanisms. We'll share the link in the chat, and please sign up for that and come along. But thanks again, Constanza. That was perfect. So thanks everyone for coming.
You.
See you next time.
Quick question.
Yeah, go ahead.
You do recordings, right?
Yeah. I don't know what happens with the recordings though.
Okay.
Maybe Anastasia knows.
I just like feel super bad about the
No,
costume.
I was
I was
watching
like,
you die, and I was
I
oh,
was
I
like
should do something
struggling
here.
to, yeah, no, thanks for intervening. Like I need some
No, that happens to me as well. Sometimes, you sip water and it goes down the wrong way.
Yeah. No, I'm so sorry about that.
No worries at all.